Hello, and welcome to Movie Spoiler Alerts. This is a compilation of all 9 of the 90th Oscars Best Picture nominees. If you aren't familiar with this channel, we summarize full-length movies to under 5 minutes, so this compilation should get you good and caught up for the Oscars. A link to the playlist, which has all the individual videos, can be found in the cards above. So let's get started. The film opens with Eliza Esposito, a mute that communicates through sign language, who also has scars on her neck. She lives in Baltimore in 1962 and is only friends with her gay advertising illustrator neighbor Giles and her coworker Zelda, who acts as an interpreter for her at their work, a secret government laboratory where they work as janitors. A mysterious river creature from South America is captured and brought to the facility by Colonel Richard Strickland. Eliza discovers the humanoid creature and begins to develop a bond with it. Seeking to exploit the creature for advantages in the space race, Strickland is ordered to vivisect the creature. A scientist, Robert Hofstetler, a secret Soviet spy, unsuccessfully pleads to keep the creature alive for study, and he is ordered by his Soviet leaders to euthanize the creature. Eliza learns of the vivisection and has her neighbor Giles help her free the creature. Scientist Hofstetler discovers the plans and helps her, and so does Zelda. Eliza keeps the creature in her bathtub, planning to release him into the ocean in a few days. Eliza and Zelda are interrogated by Strickland, but he finds nothing. At the apartments, Giles finds the creature is eating one of his cats. Startled, the creature slashes Giles' arm and runs. Eliza is able to get the creature back into the apartment. The creature touches Giles on his balding head and his wounded arm, and the next day, his hair is growing back and his arm is fully healed. Eliza and the creature develop a romantic relationship, even having sex in the bathroom which she floods. Scientist Hofstetler is shot by his superiors, which Strickland witnesses, kills the superiors, and tortures Hofstetler for the information on Eliza and Zelda. Strickland threatens and intimidates Zelda at her home, causing her husband to reveal where Eliza and the creature are, and discovers that they are going to the canal. At the canal, Eliza and Giles say their goodbye, but Strickland arrives and attacks them. Both Eliza and the creature are shot, and they both appear to die. The creature is able to heal himself, and then slashes Strickland's throat. As the police arrive, the creature jumps into the canal with Eliza, and heals her wounds. He then also changes the scars on her neck into gills, so she can breathe underwater. As the film concludes, we hear Giles expressing that he believes Eliza lived happily ever after with the creature. So let's get started. The film follows Christine McPherson, a high school senior in Sacramento who prefers to go by the name Lady Bird. She lives in a rather poor home with her parents, her adopted older brother, and his girlfriend. Lady Bird and her best friend Julie join the school's theater group, and she meets Danny. A romantic relationship develops, but it is broken off after Lady Bird discovers that Danny is gay. She is at first upset, but later on encourages him to come out. Lady Bird takes a job at a coffee shop and meets Kyle. A romantic relationship develops, and eventually Lady Bird loses her virginity to Kyle, after Kyle implies that he is a virgin too. Lady Bird is upset and is consoled by her mother. She later on becomes friends with a popular girl named Jenna. Lady Bird, wanting to impress Jenna, tells her that her address is actually the house that belongs to Danny's grandmother. Jenna later discovers that Lady Bird lied, and this starts the end of their friendship. Lady Bird finds out that her father had recently lost his job and discovers that he is battling depression. She applies to various colleges, dreaming of going to the East Coast, despite her mother saying they can't afford it. She receives many rejection letters, but discovers that she is on the waiting list for a New York university. Even though their friendship isn't very good, she goes to prom with Kyle, Jenna, and Jenna's boyfriend, but the three decide to go to a party instead. Lady Bird is dropped off at her old friend Julie's apartment, and they rekindle their relationship and go to prom together. Her mother discovers that she applied to schools out of state and gives her the silent treatment. However, she is accepted into the New York University, and her father is determined to help her afford it. Lady Bird celebrates her 18th birthday as her father jokes that he and her mother can't get a divorce because they can't afford it. She buys a few celebratory items to celebrate turning 18. She leaves for New York with her mother still not talking to her. Lady Bird is upset, and her mother has a change of heart and tries to see her, but she is already gone. Once in New York, she finds letters wrote from her mom and decides to go by the name Christine again. She is briefly hospitalized after drinking too much at a party and stops outside of a church on the way home. She calls her mom and leaves an apologetic message as the film concludes. The film is more a series of events to tell the tale of a mother and a daughter's relationship during her last year of school, with no events being particularly important to the plot. In 1940, during the fall of France, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers have retreated to the beach at Dunkirk. Tommy, a young British private, is the sole survivor of a German ambush. At the beach, he finds thousands of troops awaiting evacuation and meets Gibson, who is burying a body. After a German dive bomber attack, Tommy and Gibson rush his stretcher onto the hospital ship hoping to get on board and escape, but are denied passage themselves. The ship is sunk by dive bombers, and Tommy saves Alex, another soldier. They leave at night on a destroyer, which is sunk by a torpedo from a U-boat. Gibson saves Tommy and Alex, and they are brought ashore by a rowboat. The Royal Navy requisitions as many civilian vessels that can get close to the beach. Mr. Dawson and his son Peter and their friend George set out on the boat themselves. At sea, they rescue a shell-shocked officer from a wrecked ship. When the officer realizes that Dawson is sailing for Dunkirk, he creates a struggle that causes George to fall and suffers a head injury that renders him blind. 3 Spitfires head towards France. After their leader is shot down, pilot Ferrier assumes command with a shattered fuel gauge, but the other Spitfire is hit and crashes. Its pilot, Collins, is rescued by Dawson's boat. Tommy, Alex, and Gibson join a group of Scottish soldiers and hide inside a trawler until the tide rises. German troops shoot at the boat for target practice. When the tide rises, water enters through the bullet holes. Alex, hoping to lighten the boat's load, accuses Gibson, who has been silent the entire time, of being a German spy. Gibson reveals that he is actually French, and he assumed the identity of the soldier that he had buried earlier in the film, hoping to evacuate with the British. Alex, Tommy, and the Scottish soldiers abandon the fishing boat when it begins to sink. Gibson is entangled in chains and drowns. Alex and Tommy swim to a nearby destroyer, but it is sunk by a bomber. Dawson's boat maneuvers to pick up troops, including Alex and Tommy. Peter realizes that George is dead, but when the shell-shocked officer asks, he lies and says that George will be fine. Ferrier shoots down a pursuing bomber, which crashes and ignites the oil slick from the sinking destroyer. Ferrier reaches Dunkirk, his fuel exhausted. Gliding over the beach, he shoots down a dive bomber. He lands beyond the Allied perimeter, sets fire to his plane, and is taken prisoner by German soldiers. At the beach, British Royal Navy Commander Bolton watches the last British soldiers leave. He confirms that 300,000 have been evacuated, 10 times more than Prime Minister Winston Churchill had hoped for. He remains to oversee the evacuation of the French rearguard. Alex and Tommy cross the English Channel and board a train. Dawson is congratulated for having saved so many men. The shell-shocked officer sees George's body being carried away. Peter visits the local newspaper with a photo of George, and a front-page article later commends George as a hero. Alex expects public scorn, but they receive a hero's welcome. As the film concludes, Tommy reads out Churchill's address to the nation from a newspaper. Chris Washington agrees to meet the family of his girlfriend, Rose Armitage. At the family's countryside estate, Rose's parents, neurosurgeon Dean and hypnotherapist Missy, greet Chris very warmly. Later, Rose's brother Jeremy makes unsettling comments about African Americans over dinner. Further, Chris notices that the housekeeper Georgina and the groundskeeper Walter are oddly compliant. Unable to sleep, Chris goes outside to smoke and sees the groundskeeper Walter startlingly running from the woods and Georgina staring cross-eyed at her reflection in the mirror. Missy catches Chris returning and talks him into a hypnotherapy session to cure his smoking addiction. In a trance, Chris recounts the death of his mother that was involved in a hit-and-run when he was a child. He sinks into a void that Missy calls the sunken place. He awakens, believing he had a nightmare, but realizes that cigarettes now revolt him. Walter apologizes for having disturbed him and confirms that Chris was in Missy's office. At the Armitage's annual get-together, several wealthy white people are interested in Chris, admiring his physique. Jim Hudson takes particular interest. Chris also meets a fellow African American named Logan King, who too acts strangely. Chris calls his friend, TSA officer Rod Williams, about the hypnosis and the strange behavior. He takes a photo of Logan to send to Rod, but the camera flash makes Logan hysterical, and he begs Chris to get out. The others restrain Logan, claiming that he was having a seizure. Away from the house, Chris persuades Rose to leave with him, while Dean holds an auction with a picture of Chris on display, with Jim Hudson winning. Rod recognizes Logan as a missing person and suspects a conspiracy. Rod tries to get the police involved, but he is mocked. While packing to leave, Chris finds photos of Rose in prior relationships with other African Americans, including Walter and Georgina. Rose and the family block his exit, and Missy hypnotizes him. Chris awakens strapped to a chair. A video featuring Rose's grandfather explains that the family transplants the brains of white people into African American bodies, and that the consciousness of the host remains in the sunken place, watching but powerless. Hudson tells Chris that he wants his body. Chris plugs his ears with cotton stuffing from the chair, blocking the hypnotic commands. When Jeremy comes to collect him for surgery, Chris bludgeons him, impales Dean, knocks down a candle that sets the house on fire, and stabs Missy. Jeremy intercepts him at the door, but Chris brutally kills him. He takes the car and drives away, but hits Georgina. Remembering his mother's own death, he carries Georgina into the car, but she is possessed by Rose's grandmother and attacks him, which crashes the car and kills her. Rose and Walter, who is actually possessed by Rose's grandfather, catch up with him. Chris awakens the real Walter with a phone flash, who takes Rose's rifle, shoots her, then kills himself. Chris begins to strangle Rose but cannot bring himself to kill her. The police appear to arrive, but it is actually Chris's friend Rod in a TSA car, and they both drive away together. The film follows Mildred Hayes, who is grieving the rape and murder of her teenage daughter, Angela, that occurred 7 months prior. Upset due to the lack of progress in the investigation, Mildred buys 3 billboards near her home, stating in order, "Raped while dying," and "Still no arrests. How come, Chief Willoughby?" The signs upset the town, along with Chief Willoughby and a racist officer named Jason Dixon. It is known that Willoughby is dying of pancreatic cancer, which only makes the townspeople more upset, and Mildred and her son, Robbie, are harassed and threatened, but Mildred stays strong in her opinion. Willoughby is sympathetic to Mildred's frustration, but he simply has no more leads, but feels the billboards are an unfair attack on his character. Officer Dixon threatens Red, the advertising agent who rented out the billboards, and Dixon also arrests Mildred's friend on marijuana charges. Mildred is visited by her abusive ex-husband, Charlie, who blames Mildred for their daughter's death. Willoughby brings Mildred in for questioning after she injured a dentist who was against her billboards. However, during the interview, Willoughby begins coughing up blood. Willoughby spends a very happy day with his wife and their daughters just before committing suicide. He leaves several suicide notes, including one for Mildred, letting her know that the billboards were not a factor in his suicide, and that he also secretly paid for another month of the billboards, amused by the troubles that it will bring her. Mildred is later threatened by a stranger in her store. Officer Dixon reacts to Willoughby's death by assaulting Red and his assistant. This is witnessed by Willoughby's replacement, Abercrombie, who fires Dixon. The billboards are destroyed by arson. Mildred responds by throwing Molotov cocktails into the police station, which she believes is unoccupied. Dixon was there, however, but escapes the fire with Angela's case files and is severely burned. Mildred's acquaintance, James, gives her an alibi and says that they were on a date together. Mildred agrees to go on a real date with James as a thank you. Discharged from the hospital, Dixon overhears the man who threatened Mildred bragging about an incident very similar to Angela's murder. He writes down the Idaho license plate number and starts a fight and scratches the man to get a sample of his DNA. On her date with James, Mildred sees her ex Charlie with his 19-year-old girlfriend. Charlie admits to burning the billboards, and Mildred sternly instructs Charlie to treat his new girlfriend well. Abercrombie informs Dixon that the DNA was not a match and that the man was overseas at the time of the murder. Mildred and Dixon conclude that the man must have raped some other girl and head for Idaho with a gun. While driving together, Mildred confesses to the police station fire, but Dixon isn't surprised. As the film ends, they both express reservations about their mission, but agree to decide what to do on the way. The film opens in England, May 1940, with the Labour Party demanding the resignation of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain for his failures with the Nazis. Chamberlain tells the Conservative Party that he wants Lord Halifax to replace him, but Halifax doesn't want to become Prime Minister just yet. Chamberlain is forced to go with Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, the only candidate that the other parties will support. Churchill is a grouchy and hard-to-understand man, and quickly upsets his new secretary, Elizabeth Leighton. Churchill is reluctantly invited by King George VI to form a government including Chamberlain and Halifax. Churchill also does not have a great reputation with his previous position. Parts of Parliament want to negotiate for peace with Hitler, but Churchill refuses, believing the Nazis to be untrustworthy. Churchill also lies to the public about how the Allies are losing the Battle of France, losing some respect from the French Prime Minister. Halifax and Chamberlain attempt to set up negotiations with Germany using the Italian ambassador Giuseppe Bastianini as a negotiator. Halifax and Chamberlain, who are both high members in their party, plan to resign if Churchill refuses, with the intent of causing a vote of no confidence, which would allow Halifax now to become the Prime Minister. As this is all going on in Parliament, the Battle of Dunkirk is going on, where hundreds of thousands of Allied troops are surrounded on the coast of France. Against the advice of the War Cabinet, Churchill has the 30th Infantry Brigade lead a suicide attack in order to distract the enemy so that the soldiers at Dunkirk can be evacuated. Though it looks grim, under the name Operation Dynamo, and with the help of civilians and soldiers alike, over 300,000 lives are rescued. The defeat in France has the War Cabinet pushing for negotiations with Germany. King George unexpectedly visits Churchill one night. The king expresses that he does not want to flee to Canada and rule in exile while England is attacked, and tells Churchill that he supports continuing the war with Germany. Still uncertain what to do, Churchill ends up asking passengers on the London Underground what they think, and the citizens overwhelmingly support going to war. Churchill then meets with members of Parliament who also support him. Following the success of Operation Dynamo, Churchill prepares to address Parliament, and Halifax asks Chamberlain to continue with their plan to resign, but Chamberlain is unsure. Towards the end of his speech, Churchill states, "We shall fight on the beaches, should Germany invade." Chamberlain decides to support Churchill, and the Parliament breaks out in an overwhelming applause. As the film concludes, we see Churchill's quote stating, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is courage to continue that counts." The film opens following Elio, a 17-year-old Jewish boy living in the Italian countryside with his parents. His father, a professor, invites 24-year-old Jewish-American graduate student, Oliver, to live with them for the summer of 1983 to do some academic work. Elio, a book lover and musical prodigy, at first has nothing in common with Oliver, who is carefree and charming. Elio spends his summer reading books and being with a girl named Marisa, while Oliver is interested in a local girl, which bothers Elio. Elio and Oliver begin spending more time together, which starts out as flirting, and Elio confesses that he has feelings for Oliver. At first, Oliver turns him down, but they eventually meet up and have sex. They continue their romance over the next few days, connecting physically and emotionally. However, Oliver knows that he'll have to leave at the end of the summer, so Elio's parents, who know about their relationship, recommend that the two of them go on a trip together. They spend several romantic days together, and afterwards, Oliver leaves. Feeling heartbroken, Elio is comforted by a sympathetic Marisa who only just wants to be his friend. Elio's father tells him that he also had a similar homosexual relationship in his youth, and that the love that Elio and Oliver shared is rare. During Hanukkah, Elio receives a phone call from Oliver, who tells Elio that he is engaged. After the call, the upset Elio sits and stares into the fireplace as the film concludes. The film takes place during the Vietnam War, with analyst Daniel Ellsberg photocopying classified reports on the war called the Pentagon Papers, many of which that show that the war was unnecessarily continued. Ellsberg leaked the documents to the New York Times, which they run the story, which disgraces the current Secretary of State, Robert McNamara. Katharine Graham, owner of the Washington Post, has the company just about to go for its IPO. She is conflicted how to run her paper, and she is constantly overruled by more assertive men who advise her or work for her, such as her editor-in-chief, Ben Bradley. Graham also is friends with Defense Secretary McNamara. A court injunction halts any further publication from the New York Times on the Pentagon Papers. Ben Badigan is able to get the papers from Ellsberg for the Post, and the Post goes to work on finding headline stories. The lawyers and board members of the Post urge Graham not to allow the headlines on the Pentagon Papers to run, especially because Graham might be arrested for contempt of court. These charges would also cause the company's IPO to fall through. Bradley, however, wants the story published. After some debate, Graham decides to run the story. The White House is furious, and both the Post and New York Times are set before the Supreme Court, arguing that they are using their First Amendment rights. Many newspapers across the country show solidarity for the papers, and the court rules a 6-3 victory for the newspaper. Nixon demands that the Post be barred from the White House. As the film concludes, we see a security guard a year later discovering a break-in at the Watergate complex. The film opens in 1950s London, with renowned fashion designer Ronald Woodcock making dresses for high society. Woodcock is a controlling, obsessive, demanding man who doesn't really seem to value anyone besides his sister, Cyril, who runs the day-to-day operations. He is haunted by his dead mother and stitches hidden messages into the dresses that he makes. After tossing away his previous love interest, Woodcock meets a waitress named Alma. She moves in with him and becomes his assistant and his muse. They eventually begin bickering and fighting, with Woodcock being extremely unappreciative of her, so Alma intentionally poisons him with some mushrooms. Woodcock becomes extremely ill and begins hallucinating about his mother, and Alma nurses him back to health. Woodcock is moved by Alma taking care of him, and then they eventually marry. After a while, they revert back to fighting again, and Alma decides to poison Woodcock again, but this time he has figured out what she is doing. However, he is happy about becoming violently ill and being nurtured, and views it as a sort of stress relief, and falls more in love with her. We see that this cycle continues, and eventually leading to them having children as they continue their twisted love as the film concludes. So that was the spoilers for the 90th Oscars Best Picture nominees. If you have another film you'd like to see me spoil, please let me know in the comments below. Check out movie spoiler alerts on our various forms of social media, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.